All right, so do you see the slides? I guess yes, because I can't. I have it hidden behind my screen so that way I can see my speaker notes. Actually, let me fix that. All right, so I'm going to talk. This is tighten up your Drupal code using PHPStan. The goal is to find bugs before your end users do, because we've all had that where we wrote some code, it's awesome, pass some unit tests, and then bam, shipped it to production and everything broke and we don't know why. So my name is Matt Glaman. I'm the maintainer of PHPStan Drupal, or maybe you're more familiar with Drupal Check. My D.O handle is mglaman. You can find me on Twitter at nmdmatt, or my website is mglaman.dev if you would like to connect. So first, let's talk about PHPStan. PHPStan is a PHP static analysis tool. So that's where the stan is from. So PHPStan finds bugs in your code without writing tests because it analyzes it. It's kind of like if you've ever had to work with like Golang or C or any other kind of compiled language, right? You compile it and says, oh, you got a syntax error or this doesn't match up. It tries to do that for you with your PHP code. And then there's PHPStan Drupal, which is an extension that I started back, I toyed around with it in 2018. And that was actually born out of some experiments I was having for Centauro because we wanted to try to build some products for a few folks. But it was officially released in 2019. And this extension lets PHPStan understand how to parse and read Drupal code. And then there's Drupal Check, which is a wrapper on PHPStan to get PHPStan Drupal and generic config set up. Because back in the day, it was a pain to get configured. PHPStan had a lot of extra configuration you had to do. And I don't know whoever may have attended or watched the Dries note in 2019 at Seattle, but Dries did a demo of Drupal Check. Because right before that, he sent me an email and said, hey, this is cool, but it takes like 5 steps to get running. Can we consolidate this? And it's like, I wish we could. And that's where Drupal Check was born as a way to just make it easier to get people working and running with PHPStan to do deprecation checks. Which is probably how you're most familiar with this is for running deprecation checks, but you can do so much more to write better code. And that's what we're going to learn about today. Before we dive into like PHPStan, let's go first, like, what about X? Because you probably have tools that you're using, and let's just kind of walk through them. So in this example, we're going to say, can your existing tools catch the typo in the method name? As a team lead, I review lots of pull requests, and I miss things all the time, especially typos. If I'm spending my time worrying about like architecture, code smell, leveling up my junior developers that I'm working with to be better software engineers, I'm going to miss typos. I'm going to miss like, does this method actually exist unless I'm running the code locally because I trust the test coverage. So first, let's start with linting. So you may see here that it says node is public, like we're missing the S, so it should be is published. With regular linting, you can do PHP-L and lint all of your code for syntax errors, which is great. That's like the first error that you'll hit. It's a good first step for your integration, but it doesn't catch typos or calls to invalid methods. It just makes sure that PHP can compile your code, like right, hit the web server, compile the PHP script, execute it. It doesn't know if there's going to be an error that's hit or not. Another tool we're all familiar with is PHP Code Sniffer. So what PHP Code Sniffer does is there's actually a function called token get all that tokenizes the given source code in one file. So it's able to take a file, tokenize it, kind of go line by line and analyze it. So it can detect calls to like undesired functions, like if you left DPM in your code, like it can say, hey, you shouldn't have this here. But it doesn't detect like classes and methods called on classes. So it's great for coding standards and basic code smell checks. It helps keep code tidy, but it does not necessarily find bugs along the way. So it's again something that you should have as part of your software development life cycle, but it's not going to catch these things that static analysis would do. We'll talk about Fan and Psalm. So these are two other static analysis tools that exist in the PHP community. Fan was created out of Etsy, and I have a typo. I didn't realize I have a typo in Etsy's name, but it requires the PHP AST extension. AST stands for Abstract Syntax Tree. And when you do static analysis, you take the code as written words and it gets converted into a syntax tree. There's Psalm, which is another static analysis tool. It does not require the AST extension. Psalm is built by Vimeo, and it has a higher focus on like security. Not higher focus, but it has some really cool security integrations. These don't work out of the box with Drupal because Drupal has a dynamic autoloading system, right? We can turn on and turn off modules, which means that we have dynamic namespaces. So this is what can make it difficult to have static analysis tools work with Drupal because it doesn't know how to necessarily read everything. And that can be a complication because it doesn't know how to like load the classes correctly. And that's where we have PHPStan. So PHPStan uses the PHP parser library to create an abstract syntax tree whenever it scans it. That's also what Psalm uses. The cool part is that it verifies calls to classes and their methods. So if a class exists, and are you calling a method that exists, is maybe you're calling a private or protected method, so you're not actually allowed to. It can warn you about that. It also verifies types that are passed in, functions and types that are of arguments that are passed into functions and methods. And it also has a system for helping teach PHPStan what kind of type is going to be returned. And Drupal has a lot of dynamic return types. So this has actually been really great to try to make the system a little bit smarter when reading Drupal code. And that's what we're going to dive in through. But with PHPStan, you can see I drew the red box over is publi, is that it's going to say, hey, this method doesn't exist. So you should, like, there's an error on hand. So let's talk quick about what else PHPStan can do for you and your code. This is a really high level overview. I'm going to go like a TLDR. It's very long, so you don't need to read it all. But basically, when you run at level 0, which I have a pin for, when you run on 0, it will check for like unknown classes or functions and methods, and it does like argument count, undefined variables. It's very basic, but when you run at level 0, it guarantees that PHPStan can even run, because sometimes you may run it and you actually have bugs you weren't aware of that causes PHPStan to crash. So starting at level 0, and then there's level 2. So level 2 does checks for unknown methods to all objects and actually validates your PHP docs. So that's a good starting point as well. I usually start at level 5 for my new projects, and that gets all the way to find like redundant code, does type checks of arguments, make sure that I'm not passing a string to something that expects an integer, or I'm going to pass null to something that doesn't accept null. I start at 5, but I have all my projects actually at level 9 when I work on them. So all of my custom code that goes for Drupal passes at level 9 with PHPStan. So one thing that's cool is Drupal 10 about 2 months ago had PHPStan added to it, and it's running at level 0. That's why I have the 0 badge. I realize my lighting's horrible and I can't do it. I'm wearing my PHPStan shirt, and with the shirt, we were sent a bunch of pins that have the different levels that you run on. When I talk about level 0 and it being important, like PHPStan crashed several times against Drupal core. One of them is due to just a generic bug, and other things were just bugs in Drupal that we had to fix that we didn't know about, and PHPStan uncovered them when they tried to like load all the files. So let's go, and we're going to walk through analyzing that sample code I had earlier on with PHPStan via slides. And again, this would be running at level 2. So the example had on a hook node insert entity interface, right? This looks like this should look like pretty boilerplate code that you'd have with a hook. And we have if node publi, we have the typo here. So PHPStan would say call the undefined method. Call the undefined method entity interface is publi. Like is publi is not defined on entity interface. So now we're going to fix that typo. And we have is published. We run it again, and it says call the undefined method is published on the entity interface. Well, what? We know that nodes have is published. Well, PHPStan is telling us, hey, your types are wrong. Your hook node insert actually receives a node that is of node interface. And once you fix that typing to say that, yes, my argument is node interface, it's great because node interface extends entity publish interface, which has that method on it. So right there, scanning PHPStan, it's not necessarily a bug, but it helped you verify your code to know that it's running as it should be, that the method exists, and then you fix your types and everything's good to go. So we'll talk quick. Now that you see how vaguely, representationally, see how PHPStan can work and analyze code, let's talk about PHPStan itself and some of the extensions. So again, we said PHPStan checks classes, detects, checks classes and makes sure that they can be auto-loaded, because that's one thing too. Like a class exists, but maybe it can't be auto-loaded by Drupal, and it could warn you about this. I screw up annotated plugins all the time. I put plugin classes in the wrong area, and it tells me, Matt, you put it in the wrong spot. Detects incorrect namespacing. Again, this is something I wish I had about 4 or 5 years ago when Boyan and I were writing Drupal Commerce 2. We both have Macs, which are case insensitive, and we had a namespace. And the namespace, we put like a lowercase c for Drupal core instead of uppercase C. Well, with auto-loading and namespaces, the namespace maps to a directory. And we pushed it to, it was great on our Mac OS, pushed it to Travis CI, and it failed. And it took us 3 days to figure out that we had a lowercase c and a namespace of a file instead of the uppercase C. And if we would have had a good static analysis tool, we wouldn't have wasted 3 days of senior developer time wondering why it worked on our machines, but not on the CI system. It can also detect if functions exist. And one cool thing is it actually resolves variable values and can verify their types. If anybody's interested in that tidbit, I did a deep dive on it this week, and I'll have a recording that's out. So that was actually really cool to finally dig into. And then with PHPStan Drupal, some of the features, I'm going to dive into these more, but basically, like if you fetch services from the container, they let PHPStan know the correct types. A bunch of cool helpers with entity storage and class resolvers. And one thing it adds is checking for global deprecated constants. I can't remember if that's covered later on, but I'll make sure to circle back on why that's like a special thing for deprecated global constants. And then some of the extensions. There we go, not updated. So there's the PHPStan deprecation rules. So if you did any upgrades from Drupal 8 to Drupal 9, that extension was your lifeblood. That is the magic behind upgrade status and Drupal Check, which, by the way, I forgot to mention, upgrade status runs PHPStan under the hood for you. So deprecation rules basically finds whenever you call a function or method and sees if its PHP doc has @deprecated, and then allows us to return that message. So that's a special sauce that helped us get through 8 to 9 and is helping us get through the 9 to 10 upgrade. There's PHPStan PHP unit, which integrates with PHP unit and kind of is neat because if you do like self assert instance of, it is able to infer like, oh, this value, if this passes, this value is this type. And then there's PHPStan prophecy. If you do a lot of testing and use the prophecy for mocking, this allows PHPStan to understand the mocks that you're generating with PHP unit, which is really nice if you do a lot of testing. Because I run PHPStan on my unit test as well as my regular, like, quote unquote, real code. So, because I know I'm talking to developers and developers always want to play, I'm going to jump in quick on how you add PHPStan to your Drupal code base. And let's see, why did it say what I add? Here we go. So the one trick is PHPStan Extension Installer. How I said before, Drupal Check was created to make it easy to set up PHPStan. That was before the extension installer. So what you do is whenever this exists, it automatically wires up your extensions. Before you had to edit like a file and manually include them, and it was a nightmare and it was prone to mistakes, especially because PHPStan uses neon files, which are like YAML files, but another markup language. So this is the basic command. You do composer require -- PHPStan / PHPStan, and then PHPStan / extension installer, then M Glaman PHPStan Drupal, and then PHPStan deprecation rules. Again, It's a lot to add, but this is a one-time step. And that will give you PHPStan in your required dev. And then you can do PHP vendor /bin /PHPStan analyze, do -- level 2, because we want to start at level 2. Print it to web modules custom, and bam, your custom modules will be scanned and analyzed. And in PHPStan, this is how I do it, which is pretty much the same, except I add in the PHPStan PHP unit and prophecy. And then I actually create my phpstan.neon file. So again, I said it uses neon files over YAML. Very much the same thing. But you can specify parameters. So level :5 means start at level 5 and then pass. So instead of always having to run the command and say this path, you can actually pass it an array of paths. So in this case, my modules that are custom and my themes. So that way, when you want to run PHPStan, you just call it and it runs without needing to provide the level or paths. So that's like a quick brief on PHPStan and how it works and how you can add it in. So let's talk about PHPStan Drupal and this extension and what magic it brings. So I've brought up the word autoloading a few times. Before I get too far, I want to make sure everybody understands what autoloading is. So autoloading says that given, I say like Drupal /core /entity manager, the system knows via composer that that is mapped to core lib Drupal core, and it maps the namespace to a directory. And that way it can load classes. That's why file names. So if it's entity type manager, the class is entity type manager and the file name is entity type manager.php. So it maps the class name to be a file name, and then it can use the namespace to map to a directory. Now, when you use a regular PHP application, so if it's Laravel, Symfony, or you're just writing a library, that autoloading in the namespaces always gets dumped to a file. So in your site, you have vendor/composer or vendor/autoload.php. That's because it all gets dumped to the system. But in Drupal, we can have dynamic namespaces because we have modules that can be installed and uninstalled. PHPStan supports a path-based autoloading where you can just say, yeah, autoload everything in this directory for me. But I want the goal of PHPStan Drupal is to mimic the Drupal bootstrap process. Because if we say, sure, autoload everything in this directory, it's not really analyzing how Drupal would run. And I want the static analysis tool to actually read and bootstrap Drupal like it would if it was serving a web request. Drupal also has various legacy includes for legacy functions, like include /bootstrap.inc or the file.inc, although I think that's now gone in Drupal 10. So PHPStan Drupal ensures that those are loaded because functions cannot be auto-loaded. All extension namespaces are currently registered at runtime. So if I did like some performance profiling on Drupal core, so that means like 136 modules are detected because it includes all the test modules. There's some future work that can help scope that down, but it just ensures that all the extensions can be processed. One thing that it does is it checks to see if your extension has like a hook file. So if you see that views.inc, tokens.inc, pathauto.inc, it knows of those hook files and will include them so that way the functions can be discovered and parsed. It also loads some drush includes because if you have drush commands inside your modules, it's going to load drush. And sometimes there's some functions that aren't auto-loaded and that creates an error. So that is also handled. So on top of the auto-loading, the next part is run the service container, right? Like we all have seen /Drupal : service, entity type manager, or some other service. When reading the static code, that means nothing. So we have integrated with it that it returns the correct types. So during that bootstrap, when it reads the Drupal code, it actually loads all the extensions and parses their services.yaml. So that way, whenever we see a service call, we can load a service map and return those values as appropriate. So this allows us to detect calls to deprecated services. Unfortunately, this was like half completed during the 8 to 9 migration and was fixed after 9. So that when we really needed it, it wasn't fully fleshed out. I apologize for that, but now it's good. So if you do container get or Drupal service and you call deprecated service, it will report that you called an invalid one. And it allows checking if you called a deprecated method on the service. Because otherwise PHPStan would say, I don't know what this is, so I can't inspect it. So the idea is that if you were to call, entity type manager do deprecated function, it'll say, hey, entity type manager is not deprecated, but you did call a deprecated method on it. So that's a huge win. We have some really cool entity integration. And what PHPStan Drupal allows is creating an entity mapping so that we have a repository of entity information. Again, Drupal is very stateful. We have a database that looks up all this information and stores it. PHPStan Drupal shouldn't replicate that, but it should be able to say if you do entity type manager get storage block or node, that it's the right node storage class, and then it returns a certain entity type, so that way your code can be read more efficiently. And that's what this does. So it's a hard-coded mapping right now. We have all the entity types defined for Drupal core. There's documentation on how Contrib can add their own. But what this ensures is with your code, whenever it runs into manipulation of entity types, it knows what classes and storage we're working with. And I have some quick examples of that pulled out from our test coverage. So we have the entity type manager. We say get storage node, and it knows that it's node storage. Get storage user, it's the user storage, and then taxonomy term, it's term storage. If we did block, it would know that block is a config entity and return back the default config entity storage. And then we can actually do some cool work on storage methods. So if you were to dig deep in the code, get storage returns a generic storage interface, and on that generic interface, create says return Drupal entity interface, which is basic and doesn't have many methods on it. So we have it that if you call node storage create, it actually says, oh, you received a node. If you do load unchanged, load multiple, it says that you have the correct type. The nice part with like load multiple is that it knows it's an array of nodes. So as PHPStan checks your loop, so let's say you did for each nodes, it knows that each of those items is already a node object. We have some inspection for entity queries, and this was a huge one to get through because it always annoyed me that execute has a return type of array or int. And it's like, well, that's great. Like, how do I know what it is? Because by default, when you do an entity query, it returns an array of entity IDs. Unless you flag it as a count query, then it returns the number of entities found. So we in PHPStan Drupal, it actually checks for count being called and tells PHPStan that it's an entity count query. So that way, when we hit execute, we can say that, yes, this is a count query. The return type is an integer, not an array. And based off the entity type, we return if it's an array keyed by integers or if it's keyed by string. Content entities have numeric IDs, so it's keyed numerically. The value is a string just because of how PHP gets stuff from the database, but config entities have string identifiers, so that's why the key is a string and the value is a string. One thing that is a to-do that I need to work on is in Drupal 10, you are required to call access check on your entity queries. I'm not a big fan of this change, but I'm going to work on getting PHPStan to catch that. So if you were to call get query and execute without specifying access check, in Drupal 10, it throws an exception. I want PHPStan to warn you immediately that you called an entity query that did not perform access checks. Backstory on why they did that is to be more explicit because sometimes people were running queries that had access checks applied when they didn't want it to. Yeah, there's a change record for that. I do want to give kudos to Benjamin Rambo for the major contributions to the entity storage and dynamic return type extensions. I've been working on PHPStan for a while, and all of a sudden he came in and just tossed up a bunch of these pull requests to really improve the entity system. And that was really awesome having somebody come in and contribute those items. This is a new one. So if you caught a bit of this recording from Florida Drupal Camp, while traveling to Florida Drupal Camp, I had an idea of we need to improve the analysis of fields. And I've had a few people come up to me and say, hey, I've said that this is a blah, blah, blah field type, but when I get like arrow value off it or something else, it says it can't be found. PHPStan has a concept of stub files, and stub files augment discovered classes. Think of it as ways like fixing a class. So we've all worked with Drupal's field system where it's entity, get, first, and then some magical property attached to it. Well, what this allows us, what is now in PHPStan Drupal is it says, in this example, password item has a nullable string that says existing and a bool for pre-hash. I thought I had the link item in here. That's actually the next slide. That's a better example. But all of Drupal core's fields have their stub files added. It's missing stubs for a bunch of core modules and again, contrib, which actually there is a way contrib could provide their own. But an example of this is you're working in your code and you say that link field equals node get field link in first because all fields are actually a list of field items. So first gets you the first field item. And what this will allow you to say is link field title. PHPStan is aware that it's a string. Link field URI, it's a string. Link field option is an array of mixed because it could be who knows what. So that's a new feature to help make it PHPStan more aware of field analysis while working on your code. If you want to get full analysis, it does cause you to be a little bit more verbose, like get the field item value and then assert that it's that type, and then it will work. So it requires a little bit of mapping around, but it does at least make PHPStan aware of these field values. Render arrays. So PHPStan Drupal does have basic analysis of render arrays, which I thought was going to be really, really hard and turned out not to be too bad. One of the big reasons for this is with all the security problems that we were having with render arrays, as folks became really crafty at finding ways to inject code that got returned in render arrays, is that a callback has to implement trusted callback interface or render callback interface or be a closure if closures are anonymous functions. So what PHPStan Drupal does is it checks pre-render, post-render, the access callback, and lazy builder to see if the value is a closure or if it's like a method or a function. If it's a method, that method is on a class which implements trusted callback interface or render callback interface. If it's a function, it returns an error because functions can't be trusted because it could be who knows what. It also supports the normal and service name callable format. So Drupal has a way that you can specify a callback as like my service : and then the method name. So that is supported. It also warns you if using a closure within a form class. And if you don't know, closures, anonymous functions can't be serialized in the database. It doesn't work. And Drupal forms get serialized to the database all the time. So when you submit a form, it caches the form in the database and then it loads it back up in processing. So it warns you if you've attached a closure to a form the best that it can. If you were to attach like a closure in an element that's in a form, it won't detect that. But if you're in a form class and you write something, it will be able to detect that for you. We have support for loaded includes. So if you're in the D7 world, you know the module load include function. We probably don't use it as much anymore in Drupal 8, 9 realm, but there is module handler interface load includes, and module load include has actually been deprecated and removed in Drupal 10. But whenever we encounter this, we verify that the extension exists. Because load include is like load include, the extension name, file name, and something else to it. So if the module doesn't exist, it throws an error. And then verifies that the file exists too. So that way, if you do a load include, it tells you if you've grabbed something wrong and runs a require once to bring that file into scope and its functions available for inspection. Because if you were to do load include and then call a function in that file, PHPStan before would say this function doesn't exist. I don't know what you're talking about. So it helps ensure that those included files work. Let's go through some miscellaneous awesome because they're just some cool things that it does, but it's not necessarily like major callouts. There's a class resolver inside Drupal. You don't see it much, but it's like popular in workspaces. I've seen a lot in like client code. It's when you don't want to make something a service and it becomes like a public API, but you want to put stuff in a class. So the class resolver has a get instance from definition, and it takes that class and then constructs it. It's like magical. It just says, sure, it's a factory. You give me a class name and I'll create that instance for you. So this way we can read that get instance from definition. PHPStan Drupal finds that class, says, yep, the item returned will be of that class. So when it reads this code and says entity type build, it knows that entity type build is a method on entity type info. So that way we can do proper inspection of that class. And a good reason to do that is on the other side, like let's say that you're using a class that's marked as internal, it could warn you that, hey, using class resolver, you constructed a class that's internal and it could break. We have insights for access results, and yeah, this is just entity access results. So with one of the things with the major change from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8 is we created access result objects, which are super cool because it invokes like trinary logic that you have allowed, neutral, or forbidden. And if it's not explicitly allowed, it's like if it's neutral, you don't get access. If it's forbidden, shut it down. We're not going to check any further. If it's allowed, great. The problem is to make porting code from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8 easier, it defaults to returning a Boolean value. But if you pass it along far enough, like in the case down here, if you pass a fourth parameter to true, it returns the value object of an access result. So we have a dynamic return type that lets you know, because otherwise the default PHP doc says access result interface or Boolean. So you don't know what you're necessarily getting. But in the first example, by default, it acknowledges that it returns a Boolean. And then later on, in the second example, we said true. Yes, give us back the access result object. And we get that back. So that way in your code, you can know what types you're dealing with. Which again, the main thing here, like a lot of this is like nuanced, right? Like this is stuff that when you're reviewing code, you may not realize. Like somebody might say, you know, result equals access control handler access if access result arrow allowed. But what if they got a Boolean back? Without really reading the code and noticing that they didn't ask for the access result back, you're going to have a bug right there. And if you don't have full test coverage, which I hope everybody's doing test-driven development, but I know not everybody is, that the code would crash, and PHPStan can help catch those. I brought up about extending internal code. So a lot of times code might be annotated with @internal, right? The class is there, but it's not really meant to be used outside of wherever it lives. So PHPStan Drupal will check if a class extends @internal outside of its namespace. So its namespace is if you have like Drupal core component or the module. So if you have Drupal my module extends something internal in Drupal/core, we say, whoa, you're extending an internal class from Drupal core. Don't do that. But let's say that you have an internal class in your own module. We don't care because it's in your module. Like, yes, that's what internal flags are for. It's to only be usable within like your little realm. So the second part of the namespace must match. And it also helps detect if you're using internal code from a third-party package. And again, I just want to quick reiterate through how to add PHPStan to your code base. Again, we composer require PHPStan, the extension installer, PHPStan Drupal, and the deprecation rules. Now, you technically don't need the deprecation rules, but that is probably the biggest benefit inside Drupal since we're always working on deprecated code for each minor version. Symfony is the same way. I'm not sure about Laravel, but it's one thing, like no matter what PHP code you work with, always have the deprecation rules to save yourself pain in the end. And again, you can run it with vendor bin PHPStan analyze level 2 with web modules custom. Or the earlier example, which I can share again, where you just write your config file. Some fun parts. What's on the horizon? One thing that needs to happen, and this is not just for PHPStan Drupal, but also for Drupal Rector. So for those who don't know, last year when I was on my own, I actually had a sponsorship from Palantir.net to work on Drupal Rector. Now that I'm at Acquia, I stopped doing sponsorships because it feels weird for that stuff, but I still do it on my free time. We need to track change records from Drupal core to make sure that one, PHPStan Drupal is catching all the deprecations, and two, so that way Drupal Rector can have rules written. So PHPStan scans your code and reports things back. Rector fixes things that it knows about. And a lot of the deprecations work if we have at deprecated, but there's two issues so far where I found out that code was deprecated, but only via runtime. So if like you're running your code and it happened to come across this code, it would log an error in your database. That doesn't help you too much. So just reviewing all these change records to make sure that there's the proper annotation. Or in one case, like an array key was deprecated when creating a condition plugin via the plugin manager. That's not something that can easily be deprecated. So I wrote the code that says, oh, we have the condition plugin manager. You called create interface. Did you pass a context to the argument? So that way we can warn about issues there. I want to add better support for entity fields and field properties. That line's in there from before I wrote the field stubs, but I want to do even more. I want PHPStan to like read your code without any finagling and just know what a field type is and the properties that exist. So one thing I want to do about this is to create a drush command that you could run on your site to generate the entity mapping and field information. I wrote a blog 2 months ago and found out about a new drush feature for drush 10 that allows you to provide commands in any kind of PHP library via just autoloading. So PHPStan Drupal can actually provide a drush command that you can run and generate file, like a configuration file that it could consume. And when that's available, it could say that these are the entity types and oh, these are the fields attached. So when you say node get this field value, it could actually look up and make sure that it has the appropriate field type. And it has just like an endless amount of capabilities because field items are a list, which is an iterator. So we can tell PHPStan that this is a field item list that contains these field classes. And we can just have all kinds of crazy analysis. So that's one thing that I want to keep working on. And of course, I'm open to all your suggestions, all your bugs. We just had a bug that came up where all that fancy entity type integration for storage breaks if you do like /** at var that this storage is a node storage. It breaks everything actually. So there's a few bugs. We try to make it work great, but then there's always quirks that pop up. So as you use it, I love seeing the bug reports come in and knowing that people are using it to make their code better. I have a few resources that I want to share. So one, at Florida Drupal Camp, I created the PHPStan channel in the Drupal Slack. So you can join it to ask questions or see what other folks are using. I know that off the top of my head, the OpenSocial folks are running OpenSocial against level 8. They have a lot of like baseline errors, but they're doing it for all their code, and so is Previous Next. Previous Next has heavily gone in on PHPStan, and they've been opening bug reports for me. I also have the GitHub bot set up in that channel to notify of new releases. So if you're not using libraries.io or something else and you're just curious when a release comes out, I have that set up in that channel. And I'll share out these links. So one problem that I had with the PHPStan stuff is there's no good way to do documentation. GitHub, I don't like GitHub at all for anything, especially its wikis, because the wikis, you have to like give somebody like contributor access to the entire project to be able to edit a wiki. Where Drupal.org is actually really great for having shared documentation that can be contributed to. So on Drupal.org, the docs, development tools, there's now PHPStan, and that's the way to document using PHPStan with Drupal. And if you're not necessarily a coder, but you want to help out and contribute, this could be a way. You can help, run PHPStan and write documentation to make it easier to run it. PHPStan.org is the main website, and there's a cool playground available on phpstan.org. And since I have, I'm not off Wi-Fi, so there is actually a playground in here. So if you have some generic PHP code, it can run PHPStan for you, and you can see it live in action. Now, as a note, obviously you can't copy your Drupal code in here because it doesn't know about the Drupal code. But if you have like a weird function that's not really tied to Drupal and you're like, this doesn't make sense, you can play around with it in here. But of course, the main thing is the documentation for when you want to configure and just learn a few things. The repo at PHPStan Drupal, and I'll share this in the chat right away for anybody that wants to read this. I didn't want this session to be heavily on like what is static analysis and how do abstract syntax trees work. That presentation covers all of that, and that is the wonderful contributor who's helped out a lot with PHPStan Drupal. So that's a really cool presentation to read. And then also I want to share that I'm on Twitch. So one way that I keep the fun alive with open source contribution is I do it live, because that's just better than toiling away at it. And I like to just share some knowledge. So I do that Wednesdays at 2 p.m. Central on Twitch. If you're ever curious to tune in, it's a very complicated subject. And if I can work on it and either show my faults that I am human and everybody screws up code, or just show like tips and tricks, it's been one way to take this project and give it and have it make a bigger impact for other folks. And that's all I've got for my slides. I'm going to bring it back to at least the require page for anybody that wants to stare at it. And any questions?
Not a question, but just, oh, can you hear me?
Yeah? Yes.
Oh, okay. My audio is straight. Not a question, but just thank you for all your contributions to the update. And, you know, we had to update a lot of sites to Drupal 9, and I don't know how we would have gotten through it without the tools that you built. And so it's just great to have an opportunity to thank you in person for that, or quasi in person. Yeah.
Yeah, I had no idea that it would blow up like it did. Because we were at Centauro, we like, Drupal Commerce, we're trying to figure out like how can we just help people run sites and like, oh, static analysis and code reports, because that was a lot of our job. It was still a lot of my job is reviewing code and implementations. And I was like, oh, PHPStan could do this. Turns out, well, everybody could do that on their own. But the weird value was all of a sudden Gabor was like, this thing can find deprecations. And it became like the de facto way. Like we would not have been able to pull off the 8.9 migration without PHPStan, and that's what I think is one of the it's wild how things can just come together. I guess no other questions. Well, thank you all. Well, thanks for coming.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Gonna turn off the recording. Maybe.
Thank you, Matt.
Yeah, thanks.